to welcome you to this evening's program. Thank you all for your ongoing support, and please stay tuned to the end of today's program for a brief summary on our upcoming programs. As you all know, if you'd like to ask Dan questions, there is a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions, and Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion, which will start in about 30 or 35 minutes. So Dan, it's time for me to bring you on and talk about your two terrific topics this evening. There's too much going on. Go ahead, sorry.
No, it just said good to see you, Kim.
With all of the breaking news, I know you're going to get so many questions about what's going on today, but we have two fabulous topics. So number one, leading, top of the lead, Biden places a big bet. Can he bring Democrats together behind it? And secondly, what COVID has done to American public schools. Take it away, Dan.
Well, thank you so much, Kim. And thanks to all of you, as always, for being with us for these conversations. As Kim said, there's no shortage of news for us to cover today. And the topic in today's headlines, as I think many of you have seen, is the remarkable testimony of the Facebook whistleblower in her appearance before Congress. Now, we'll cover that in some depth next week, once her allegations have a chance to resonate for a little while, and we have a sense of how the issue is going to play out politically, because of course we are politics in the time of coronavirus. But if you want to talk about it today, of course we can do that in the bottom of the hour. In the meantime, though, as Kim said, two topics for us to cover. The first being the ongoing negotiations in Washington, not between Democrats and Republicans, but between Democrats and Democrats. Now look, in a two-party system, neither Democrats or Republicans are ever going to be completely unified. But as our politics gets more and more, as our politics become more and more polarized, not only do the divisions between the two parties get bigger, but within both parties as well. And we've talked a lot in the past about the ongoing debate in the Republican Party between the pro-Trump faction and what I like to call the pre-Trump, or perhaps the post-Trump wing of the party. And we'll certainly come back to that fight many times between now and next November. But the political and the policy arguments between the progressive and the moderate sides of the Democratic Party took center stage last week. And that fight could be endangering President Biden's domestic policy agenda and possibly the Democratic majorities in Congress too. So that's what we'll talk about today, at least in just a minute. But before we do, Claire, if you can put up the first question for our group, given that we've outlined the gaps that are growing in both major parties, our first question for you is, which party's internal divisions concern you more? Is it the Republicans, the pro-Trumpers versus the anti-Trumpers? Is it the Democrats, the progressives versus the moderates in the fight we saw escalating last week? Is it both? Do both equally concern you? Or neither? You don't think either one of them is such a big deal? That's just the way democracy works. So let's see what we got from our group if we can, Claire. Oh, very interesting. More than half, look at that. More than half of our group believes that the fight between the two wings of the Democratic Party concerns them more. 29% say both the Democrats and Republicans. Only 15% are as concerned about the Republican split as about the divide in the Democratic Party, and 3% say neither. But interesting, by almost a 4-to-1 margin, our group believes that the split in the Democratic Party is of more immediate concern. So let's talk about the Democrats. All right. On one side, or I guess I should say in this corner, you have the party progressives. So this is the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wing of the party, which is growing quickly in size and influence. Then there's the moderate wing of the party, and that's the Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, and Joe Biden faction of the Democratic Party. And after circling each other for months, last week these two Democratic parties went at each other very harshly Now, we've put off talking about the debate over President Biden's domestic agenda on infrastructure and social spending for some time now. And the reason we haven't talked about it for so long is because week after week, month after month, the Democrats have been maneuvering and negotiating, but it doesn't seem like there's been very much of a breakthrough. And so I always thought we would just hold off on that conversation until we began to see the possibility of some breakthrough. Well, I don't know that we see a possibility of much breakthrough at this point, but given the news of last week, it did seem worthwhile for us finally to dig in a little bit deeper on these priorities of the president's. So look, even though Biden won the Democratic nomination last year with a very centrist and a very establishment message, the most left-leaning Democrats, the Democrats who supported Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, they never went away. They just bided their time, and they're now reemerging very strongly and very loudly. The Congressional Progressive Caucus shut down Biden. They shut down Nancy Pelosi. They shut down the party's entire moderate bloc last week when they prevented Biden's bipartisan infrastructure proposal from coming to a vote. And that's left a very uncertain path forward for the president's top domestic policy goals. Now, Biden and Pelosi and Senator Chuck Schumer have spent most of the year trying to balance between two sets of competing priorities from their party's two main ideological factions. The moderates want to pass the infrastructure bill. This is housing, roads, broadband expansion. The moderates want to pass the infrastructure bill so they can campaign in competitive districts next year on the basis of a large-scale and very tangible accomplishment. Liberals are just committed to the second and much larger social spending and climate change package. It's known as the reconciliation bill because of the means that if it passes through Congress the way it would pass. But liberals believe that their reconciliation bill won't attract enough support from Democratic moderates if the infrastructure legislation is finished first. So their idea is, we'll give you your infrastructure bill, but not until you prove to us that you're willing to pass our broader social spending and climate change reconciliation package. So that seemed to be sort of an unsquarable circle, but it did look, at least until last week, like Nancy Pelosi was going to be able to square that circle by convincing her liberal members to stand down and allow the infrastructure bill to pass first, with a promise that the larger reconciliation legislation would come later. But last week, the Progressive Caucus told both the Speaker and the President of their own party that they weren't budging. And if the reconciliation bill wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, then neither was the infrastructure legislation. And by Friday night, by the end of the week, Biden and Pelosi had largely given in to the progressives, and now neither bill appears to be going anywhere anytime soon, although Speaker Pelosi and Senator Schumer have now set an October 31st deadline for moving these bills through together. So the progressives, in essence, they flexed their political muscles last week in a way that they haven't done in many, many years. And in doing so, they made it clear that they're now calling the shots in the Democratic Party. And again, this is the kind of division that we see in both parties. Because if you look back some years, you can remember the Republicans going through the exact same thing with their Tea Party and their so-called their Opportunity Caucus. And just as George W. Bush and John Boehner and Paul Ryan at various times, and even on some occasions, even Donald Trump, were forced to come to terms with the fact that they had largely ceded control of their Republican Party to its ideological base. Biden and Pelosi are now coming to the same conclusion, just on the left rather than the right. So now after last week's success, the progressives have to decide how long they're going to hold the line against their president's infrastructure policy goals. Biden and Pelosi have given in, and they've indicated, as I said earlier, that they're going to move the two bills forward together. But the challenge hasn't changed, because unless moderate Democratic senators like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema dramatically shift course, it's hard to see how this broader spending bill can achieve anything close to the unanimous support it's going to need for even party line passage. And it is worth noting that while Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, these two senators from West Virginia and Arizona, get an immense amount of attention, there are several other centrists in the Democratic caucus who are just as committed, even if they're not quite as loud as Sinema and Manchin. So it would be a mistake going forward to assume that it's just these two rogue Democrats. In fact, the faction of moderate Democrats, particularly in the Senate, is somewhat larger. In any case, though, this leaves the Progressive Caucus with a fairly difficult dilemma to deal with. Do they give in and allow the infrastructure bill to pass on its own at some point? Because that would give Biden a signature policy accomplishment, but it would run the risk of their own signature policy of their own social spending legislation getting left behind. Or do they continue to hold firm? And if the centrists don't give in, would that deprive their president and their colleagues running in more competitive races of anything significant on which to base their campaigns? And of course, the same questions hold for the moderates. It's not just the progressives who have to decide between holding firm and compromising. The exact same questions hold for the moderates, just in reverse. So now seems like a pretty good time to go to a second question, now that we've outlined the goals and the stakes for both sides. Given that this standoff is ongoing and doesn't show any sign of ending, who do you think is most responsible for the standoff? Is it congressional progressives for not being willing to give in to a less ambitious policy package? Is it congressional moderates for not willing to go along with a much more ambitious climate change and social spending group of bills? Or is it President Biden and his administration for not doing a better job of bringing these two factions together? Or fourth, easy choice if you want to take it, all of the above. So how do we do, Claire? What does our group think? Very interesting. 45%, by roughly a 2-to-1 margin, believe that progressives are most responsible for the standoff. 45% to 22%. 30% of you took the easy way out, said, it's everybody's fault. And only 3% put the blame on President Biden. But most interesting there is that 2-to-1 margin among our group of people who think this is primarily the progressives' responsibility more than the moderates. Very interesting. Okay. Now, the left will argue that compromising too much, well, actually, let me back up a little bit. What the moderates will argue is that historical trends generally show that the president's party loses seats in midterm elections. And because the Democrats have such a slim majority now, if the Republicans take back the majority next year, it's very unlikely that either Mitch McConnell or Kevin McCarthy is going to let much of Biden's policy agenda get through. So the moderates argue that holding for their progressive colleagues to hold on to their principles this year could forfeit the Democrats' best chance for major policy accomplishments for years to come. Now, that's the center's argument. The left says, no, if we compromise too much, if we give too much away, that's going to demotivate loyal Democratic voters, and that fighting for our goals and fighting for our principles will actually be the best way to turn out our base next November, and that will allow us to expand the majorities. So both sides think that they're doing their party a favor. Both sides think that they're advancing the Democrats' prospects in the midterm elections next year. And of course, there's no way to know these things in advance. Now, the new twist on this is just last Friday, even after pulling back on the infrastructure bill for now to satisfy progressives, President Biden began hinting that this larger climate and social spending legislation, the reconciliation package, was not going to be as large as progressives want. Now, currently, that more expansive bill, which includes climate change, healthcare, affordable housing, education, children's tax credits, family leave, many of the Democratic policy goals, is estimated to add up to about $3.5 trillion in spending, along with the $1 trillion plus in the infrastructure bill, of course. Now, Senator Manchin recently said that he thought $1.5 trillion for the reconciliation bill rather than $3.5 trillion, less than half was enough. Biden on Friday suggested a compromise, something between $1.9 trillion and $2.2 trillion. And by yesterday, those numbers look like they'd gotten pretty firm and pretty solid. Progressives in the House, as of this morning, are talking about cutting back to between 2.5 and 2.9 trillion. So whether Manchin or Biden or the progressives got their way, there's big cuts coming from that original $3.5 trillion proposal, which, as Bernie Sanders would remind us, was originally a $6 trillion proposal before it cut back. So Biden's between 1.9 and 2.2. The progressives are between 2.5 and 2.9. Let's assume they compromise somewhere in the middle of that. But whatever the final number is, it's going to be a lot less than $3.5 trillion. So the next challenge for the Democrats is figuring out how to reduce the size of that legislative package. Now, there are three ways they can do that. The first way of reducing the size of that package from 3.5 trillion to 2 point something, we'll say, is to eliminate some of the programs that are being proposed. As we talked about earlier, there are a whole range of Democratic policy proposals that are part of this package. One way of doing this is to eliminate some of them and say, just like Roosevelt, just like LBJ, we'll do this a few steps at a time and come back to these other priorities at some point in the future. Now, just to give you some idea of what that means, let's say the package comes out at $2 trillion rather than 3.5. That would give the Democrats enough money for their climate change legislation, to institute a children's tax credit, and to institute a national family leave program. Now, those are pretty significant accomplishments, but it leaves out healthcare expansion, it leaves out cost-free community college, it leaves out pre-kindergarten or expanded childcare, it leaves out affordable housing. So by funding some of the programs fully, it means a lot of other things that are important to a lot of voters get left out. The second option, if it's not to choose between the programs in the reconciliation package, would be to keep all the existing programs, but only use them on behalf of lower income recipients. And this, of course, is known as means testing. And so for programs like the children's tax credit or for Medicare expansion or for preschool, instead of that being available to every American, it would only be available to those below a certain income level. This is the alternative which Senator Manchin in particular is arguing for very, very strongly, saying, why should wealthier people get the benefit of these programs? But of course, West Virginia is a very low-income, low-cost state. Some of his fellow Democrats in higher-cost states like New York and California don't like that option at all. And then the third option, if it's not to eliminate some of the programs in the original proposal, if it's not to mean test all of the programs, the third option is to keep them all, but to sunset them. That is, rather than passing a bill that establishes a new program into perpetuity, like Social Security and like Medicare, these programs would instead sunset after a certain number of years, at which point they would cease to exist. Now, this is an age-old tactic that both parties use. Democrats usually on spending measures, Republicans usually on tax cuts. And what they're doing is they're essentially pretending that there will be no budgetary impact of their proposal after 5 years or 10 years or whatever the sunset is, and then hoping future Congresses will decide that those programs are too popular and should continue to be funded. So that's the third option, but obviously that's a big risk because there's no way to predict who's going to be running Congress in 5 or 10 years and what their priorities are going to be. So another question for all of you. What do you think of those options? What is the most effective way of reducing Biden's original spending proposal down from $3.5 trillion to something much less? Should they, one, as we talked about, eliminate some of the proposed programs and fully funding the few that are most important? Number two, should we sunset the programs and only fund them for 5 years or 10 years or for a certain period before they expire? Or third, should the programs be mean tested? Should they only be provided for lower income recipients, not for all Americans? Or four, some combination of all those options. And the survey says, look at that, very interesting. 42%, a little bit less than half of our group, agrees with Senator Manchin that means testing these programs and providing them only for lower income Americans is the best way to go. Now, of course, that's more complicated than it sounds because you have to decide what the cutoff is. Should only those in poverty receive the programs? Should working class Americans? Should middle class Americans who make up the majority of the electorate, should they receive the programs? The more people you include, the less money it saves. Much less, 23%, less than a quarter, say that those programs should sunset. And interestingly, 19%, less than a fifth of our group, thinks that only a few programs should be fully funded at the expense of the others. Very interesting numbers, and I know we'll be talking more about this as time passes and the negotiations continue. Now, on top of all this, we also have the possibility of the federal government reaching its debt limit in just under 2 weeks on October 18th, which is 2 weeks from yesterday, not raising that limit. If Congress does not vote to raise that limit, that will cause the United States to default on its loans for the first time in history, and in all likelihood help precipitate a worldwide recession, just at the time that we're starting to come out of the COVID economic downturn. Right now, the two parties are pretty much playing chicken on this. Either the Democrats or the Republicans could resolve this. Both are trying to force the other party to back down. They've got 13 days to figure it out, and we can talk about this in more detail on another day. But let's move on instead to our second topic, which is what COVID is doing to our schools. Now, we've talked about coronavirus quite a bit over the last year and a half. Our program's called Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. But most of the conversations we have about COVID are focused in the present, and for good reason. Because the immediate health concerns, the immediate economic concerns, cultural conflicts, vaccine and mask debates are something we all face every day right in the here and now. But there are long-term ramifications of the virus, of the pandemic, to keep in mind too. And arguably none of those long-term considerations are more important than the tremendous impact on our children of the education and learning time that they've lost while their schools were closed. So before we go on, I'd like to ask you how concerned you are about this issue. Granted, there's a lot of other COVID-related issues to talk about, as I just alluded to, as we've talked about over the months. But how concerned are you about this one? Even now that the schools are open, given the time they missed last year, are you very concerned for all students? Are you very concerned, but mainly for low-income students and those from more difficult circumstances? Are you somewhat concerned? Or are you not really all that concerned, saying, hey, they're back in school, we'll catch up? And what does our group have to say on this one, Claire? Look at that. 54% very concerned for all students and another 30% for low-income students. Combine those numbers, perhaps not surprisingly, and 84% of our group thinks this is something that we really should be concerned about. And although, as you know, I generally don't take sides on these things, I would agree with the large majority here. We should be very concerned. And let me spend a few minutes talking about why. Well, a couple of months ago, the McKinsey consulting firm did an analysis which showed the impact of the pandemic on K-12 student learning was absolutely immense, and that a year of distance learning, which most of our students experienced last year, left them on the average more than 5 months behind in mathematics in terms of progress, and 4 months behind in reading by the end of the last school year in May or June of 2021. So given a roughly 9-month school year, that means that most students progressed last year about half as far academically as they would during a normal school year. So in other words, they got 50% of the education last year that they would get under more normal circumstances. Now, this was obviously a much worse situation for some students than others. The pandemic dramatically widened opportunity and achievement gaps that had existed before the pandemic by a huge amount. And of course, hitting historically disadvantaged students the hardest. In both math and reading, students in schools in minority communities and other low-income communities suffered almost twice as much learning loss as students from higher income environments. So a minute ago, we said that most students learned about half as much last year as they normally would. Low-income students, students from minority communities, they learned half of that. So basically, they learned a quarter last year of what they would have under more normal circumstances. Now, what else does this mean? It means high schoolers have become much more likely to drop out of school. And high school seniors, especially those from low-income families, are much less likely to go to college. And the crisis, the McKinsey study shows, had an impact not just on academics, but on the broader health and well-being of students. More than 35% of parents said that they were very concerned or extremely concerned about their children's mental health. And almost 2/3 of American parents said that they were at least somewhat concerned of the impact on their children's mental and psychological well-being. Now that's in the immediate, that's the learning and emotional loss. Let's talk about where that leads, because the long-term ramifications of this learning loss are even more massive. The fallout from the pandemic threatens to seriously harm this generation's job prospects. The ripple effects, as I mentioned earlier, are undermining their chances of attending college and ultimately making it much more difficult for them to find a fulfilling job that enables them to support a family. Today's students, by the time this is all said and done, may earn hundreds of thousands of dollars less over their lifetime, owing to the impact of the pandemic on their schooling. The impact on the US economy then could account to between $128 billion and $188 billion every year as this cohort enters the workforce over the years. And worldwide, what that means is a net income loss of roughly $12 million to school-age children who suffered the kind of learning loss that we discussed a moment ago over the course of the pandemic. Now that the schools are open, the problems are not going away. Here in LA, student enrollment has dropped by about 6%, and the losses are similar in most large cities around the country. Many of those children have relocated with their families to live in less expensive areas than a big city. Some have switched over to charter schools that stayed open for in-person education last year. But the majority, in fact, a lot of those young people have simply stopped going to school altogether. Chronic truancy is at a modern-day high across the country. Hundreds of thousands of kids who just stopped going to school last year and didn't come back now, or now attend very sporadically. Chronic absence rates between March of 2020, the time of the shutdown, until this last spring, until last March, chronic absence rates increased over that year by 39%. And as you might suspect, those rates were much higher in minority communities. The overall Latino students' chronic absenteeism rates were at roughly 21%. African American students at 30%. White students, for comparison, had chronic absenteeism rates of about 12%. Now, what it appears we're going to do next week, as opposed to today, is I'm going to talk about one possible solution to this, because researchers at Johns Hopkins University have found that a very effective strategy for struggling students, especially in elementary schools, is one-to-one or small group tutoring. And we'll talk at greater length about those tutoring programs and the prospects and the obstacles to them as one of next week's discussion points. But right here and now, before we can implement a program of that size and scope, which would take tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, a question I'd like to close out with all of you on is, given the alarming rate increase in the chronic truancy rates in the aftermath of the pandemic, what do you think is the best way for us to address chronic truancy? Number one, is it penalizing the students to suspend them or to expel them? Is it penalize the parents by fining them if their sons or daughters don't come to school with sufficient frequency, or requiring the parents to do some type of community service to incentivize them to try to convince their children to attend school? Third, do you increase the number of counselors and outreach to reach out to these young people? And fourth, do you increase distance learning and individualized learning? So for those children and parents who don't want to risk going back to school and contracting COVID, particularly until vaccines are available to younger children, might be a better option. So Claire, how'd we do on this one? 81% of you, more than 4/5, said that the way to do this is to increase counselors and outreach. And that is what most schools around the country have been trying to do, most schools and school districts, reaching out more persistently and more aggressively, both to children and to their parents, trying to encourage them to return to school, reminding them of the benefits of going and the downsides of not. So far, unfortunately, this approach, which does sound like the best one, hasn't met with much success. But next week, in addition to talking about the Facebook controversy and perhaps some other topics as well, let's talk a little bit about this mentoring program and see if that might not be able to provide some long-term solutions to the children of COVID who suffered through such learning loss over the past year and a half. Okay, so we've covered two topics, and in retrospect, I'm awfully glad we dropped the third, because otherwise we wouldn't have nearly as much time for your questions and comments. So Jessica, now that I've concluded segment one, can you help me with segment two?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dan, and to our audience. Before we start the conversation, just a reminder that we rely on your support and membership to allow us to continue to host these free webinars. If you are able to, we'd love for you to become a member or make a donation to the Council. You can visit our website at lawacth.org. And again, click on the donate button or become a member. We would greatly appreciate it. All right, first question. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said he aims to pass a bipartisan infrastructure bill and Democrats' broader investment in the social safety net and climate policy by the end of October. Is that all possible or wishful thinking?
It's possible, but it's unlikely. It's worth remembering that last Thursday's deadline was an artificial one set by Speaker Pelosi, actually first last Monday, and she then extended it for a few days to the moderates to say we're going to vote on the infrastructure bill by then, whether the reconciliation legislation is ready or not. October 31st is just as arbitrary a deadline. And so here we are, we're almost a week into October. The next 2 weeks are going to be consumed almost entirely in Congress by an effort to deal with this debt ceiling crisis that we talked about. So at that point, you're only going to have 10, 12 days left before the end of the month to try to figure out how to fashion a social spending and climate change package that is much smaller than the current proposal. It is possible, and Chuck Schumer is very good at his job, but because there is no statutory or economic consequence attached to them not finishing by October 31st, like there is for the debt ceiling on the 18th, my guess is there will be a flurry of activity leading up to the end of October. But like the flurry of activity leading up to the end of September, It's merely going to lay the groundwork for another flurry of work and then another flurry. I'd say best case scenario, this is done by Thanksgiving. Next best scenario is sometime just before the end of the year. Worst case scenario is that Biden doesn't get either. And that becomes an even bigger challenge for Democrats heading into a critical midterm election year.
Have congressional leaders historically ever hired a conflict facilitator? Maybe the Democrats need a healing harm / restorative practice circle to address their differences.
I would argue too that both parties probably do, but this is either the best or the worst aspect of a two-party system. When you have multiple parties, as is the case in many countries and many parliamentary systems, everyone gets to have their own party. Well, maybe not every single person, but it's much more likely in a system with 7 parties or 9 parties or 15 parties that the members of your party are going to be more ideologically cohesive. In a two-party system, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Dianne Feinstein are part of the same political party. In a two-party system, Mitt Romney and Susan Collins are part of the same political party as Donald Trump and Ted Cruz. And so by definition, it requires some consolidation in order to pass legislation. The same dynamic holds in a parliamentary multi-party system. It plays out a little bit differently, but ultimately politics is about the art of compromise. It's about the art of the possible. And in an increasingly polarized society and in an increasingly uncompromising Congress, compromise isn't as easy to come by as it once was. And so maybe the questioner's suggestion isn't a bad one for both sides.
What do you think will happen to the current dispute over raising the debt ceiling?
I have a difficult time imagining that the debt ceiling will not be raised. I only talked about it for a moment or two earlier because we were concentrating on the other pieces of legislation. But the consequences of the United States defaulting on its debts worldwide are catastrophic. And the results in terms of loss of credit, loss of economic fluidity, but ultimately lead to loss of jobs and loss of income. And I do think it would lead to an incredibly severe recession, which, unlike COVID, is one that was entirely unavoidable. It is entirely within Chuck Schumer's power to move the debt limit, to expand the debt limit on a straight party line reconciliation vote. It's entirely within Mitch McConnell's power to give Schumer the 10 Republican votes he needs in order to get it through on a somewhat bipartisan basis. Right now, neither leader wants to move. I think it's more likely that Schumer gives than McConnell, but it's hard to imagine that one or the other doesn't.
Given that Biden has no coattails in 2020, are there any competitive seats now held by Democrats that are in danger of being taken back by Republicans in 2022?
There are many, and the moderate Democratic caucus that Representative Josh Gottheimer leads is made up almost entirely of Democratic members in districts that, under the right circumstances, could potentially switch to Republican. So there's at least a few dozen and possibly more Democratic seats that could be lost during a pronounced Republican victory cycle. In the Senate, there are 4 or 5 Democratic senators who, while they're varying degrees of favorites for re-election, again, in a big Republican year, could be in danger. And so if I were to take the question and frame it another way, what I hear the questioner saying is it possible for Democrats to lose their majority? And the answer is it certainly is. It wasn't too long ago that Republicans held a majority in both the House and the Senate. And given that the margins of the Democrats' majority are at such historically slim margins, history would say it's likely that Republicans take over. I don't know that that's the case given the unique nature of the political landscape in an almost post-COVID environment. But in both the House and the Senate, there are a number of endangered Democrats who will be in a much stronger position to achieve their reelection, they believe, if they have at least an infrastructure bill to run on, if not broader legislative accomplishments.
Will there be consequences in the party or electoral base for the way Kyrsten Sinema was followed and her privacy not respected?
For those of you who are not familiar with the questioner's reference, Senator Sinema, as I said earlier, one of the two most visible centrist leaders in the Democratic Party, was in Arizona this past weekend, and a group of immigration reform activists attended an event in which she was participating and actually followed her to the restroom. And at least one of those protesters, perhaps more, actually followed her inside the restroom and continued to advocate even while she was in the stall. Now, my own opinion is that's excessive. No matter how strongly you feel about an issue, respecting an individual's personal boundaries should be a reasonable stopping point. But I don't think there will be any consequences to it, if only because that action was not taken by an elected official. It wasn't taken by the leader of a recognizable advocacy organization. The fact that a very small number of impassioned activists may have overstepped proprietary boundaries is something that will be criticized, but I don't think it will have any ramifications on the path forward on either immigration reform or other relevant policy matters.
I also saw a video that one of those activists were approaching her on the flight as well and trying to talk to her. So I think this group has been following her quite a bit.
Yeah, and unfortunately, this is not new. This is not unique in politics, and it's not unique to the Democratic Party. We're seeing more and more examples of, I think, well-intentioned citizens on both the left and the right going much further to make their cases than they would have in the past. Those of you who are located in Southern California may have seen that the Los Angeles City Council recently voted to prohibit large-scale protests outside the homes of elected and appointed officials. And while on one hand, I would not want to diminish anyone's right to free speech, I think protesting them outside of their homes, loudly in a very disruptive way, in a way that in some circumstances can be very frightening to the officials' children, is way beyond appropriate boundaries. And as the country and as the political debate does become more and more polarized, it becomes more and more commonplace behavior. Here's hoping it doesn't become more acceptable behavior.
What percent of Democrats fall into the progressive wing? Which wing of the base is in the majority?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the progressive wing of the party is growing very rapidly in terms of size and influence. If you had polled 10, 15 years ago, a relatively small slice of the electorate would have identified themselves as liberal or progressive, and within the Democratic Party, you would have seen a larger number that refer to themselves as moderate. And those numbers have, for the most part, reversed. Identifying yourself as a progressive or a liberal has become much more popular, and those numbers are reflected in the increased influence that we're seeing from the Progressive Caucus in both the House and the Senate. Now, the same dynamic holds in the Republican Party too. A lot more people call themselves conservatives now than a generation ago, and a much, much smaller percentage call them moderates. And so what you're seeing in both parties is, for all practical purposes, a hollowing out of the center. And as I think I've told this group before, I have nothing but respect for principled progressives and principled conservatives. Not everyone needs to be a centrist like me, but I think it is helpful to have those centrist and moderate voices in both parties, in a Congress or in a legislature, if only to make it easier for those principled progressives and principled conservatives to communicate with each other. Though in both parties, the numbers have switched, and no question, that both in terms of influence and sheer numbers, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is now firmly in control. And we saw stark evidence of that last week.
Are the progressives a lot like the Tea Partiers who are willing to bring the Biden administration down in order to pick up the pieces?
We don't know yet. We don't know. I mentioned earlier the choices that face both the progressives and the moderates going forward. And ultimately, whether it's by October 31st or by Thanksgiving or by New Year's or at some point, the progressive wing of the party is going to have to say, we're not going to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we will have achieved many of our goals, but not all of them, and we're willing to step down in order to allow our more moderate colleagues in more competitive districts to gain re-election and perhaps help the president move forward also. Alternatively, they could say, no, if we compromise any further, our base, our most loyal supporters aren't going to bother to turn out on election day. So we're going to keep fighting for this, even running the risk of losing some of those centrist seats and undermining the president. If they choose to hold firm, then they do become a left-leaning version of the Tea Party. If they do decide that something is better than nothing, then my own opinion is they'll have done their party some good in terms of numbers, but they would argue back, many of them would argue back very persuasively that having a majority, they might say, that relies on more centrist Democrats like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema isn't really worth it. And maybe they should go into it makes more sense to go into the minority for a period of time in order to regenerate as a purely progressive party. That's a sentiment you hear from the most conservative voices in the Republican Party very frequently. And the result is they now hold neither the White House nor the House or the Senate. We'll see in the next few months whether progressive Democrats come to the same conclusion or a different one.
Can you comment on Attorney General Merrick Garland's memo that went out asking for federal law enforcement to take action against parents protesting at school board meetings?
Well, this is another reflection of the polarization that we were talking about earlier. And just as activists will follow an elected official into a restroom and stand outside the stall, other just as impassioned individuals will go to school board meetings and physically threaten elected school board members for implementing vaccine or mask policies that they, the parents, disagree with. In that latter problem, the idea of parents going to school board meetings and threatening elected officials has become so widespread and so pervasive across the country that teachers' unions in many states have asked their law enforcement in their states for help, and ultimately led to the Attorney General taking the steps that he did in order to make sure that these elected officials were protected, not necessarily to take their side in the vaccine or the mask debate, but to make sure an elected official accomplishing his or her responsibilities is able to do so safely.
Since I believe children in expensive private schools or those residing in wealthy suburban school districts did not suffer the same learning loss as urban public school children, does the Biden administration proposed spending proposals previously discussed focus on assisting the needier schools?
Well, this is one of the arguments that's currently taking place. And as we talked about earlier, there's three options before the Democrats for reducing the overall size of the package. Our group made it clear in response to the poll question very clearly that they thought just that type of means testing was the best path to take, providing these services, whether education, whether healthcare, whether tax credits, only to lower income voters, not to all Americans. The Biden administration has not yet come to that conclusion. This fight, interestingly, is developing not so much between progressives and moderates, but rather geographically in the Democratic Party. As I said earlier, Senator Joe Manchin represents West Virginia, one of the poorest states in the country and one of the states with the lowest costs of living. Democrats from higher cost states like California, like New York, like Florida, they don't like the idea of means testing these programs because a much larger number of their constituents are going to be left out, given that the average income level in those states is much higher. This is going to be one of the most difficult decisions that the Biden administration has to make, which is, do you cut back to a smaller number of programs in order to make sure you implement them and they're very successful? The argument there is, if you do just a few things, fully fund them and do them well, that's going to build political momentum for further change. The counter argument is the one implied in the question that was just asked. Yes, but doesn't it make sense to devote these resources to those most in need and not to upper income voters and families? We'll see over the next several weeks how it ultimately plays out, but at this point, we simply don't know. My guess, real quick before you go on, Jessica.
Sorry.
Third option, which we've sort of overlooked, the idea of sunsetting these programs. I think that one's going to sound much more appealing to Democrats going forward. Because if you cut programs altogether, then you're not making progress in policy areas that are important to your voters. If you means test, then you're leaving out voters who would benefit from the programs, and maybe not as much as low-income voters and low-income families, but who still realize great benefit. But if you sunset those and say for 5 or for 10 years, we'll fund them fully, and then we'll see what happens. At least for right now, through your next couple of re-elections, you're covered, and it's somebody else's problem by the time the bill comes up, the program comes up for renewal. Sorry about that.
No, sorry, my audio is a little bit delayed too, so I'm trying to also listen for your pauses, and I apologize if I stepped on your words.
No worries.
Okay, how can both parties risk maddening the people who rely on Social Security and Medicare? And somebody also asked, if you start means testing programs, how do you protect Social Security and Medicare universality?
Okay. And now I lost you for just a second, Jessica. Can I ask you to repeat the question?
Sure. So I'm combining two questions. The first was, how can both parties risk maddening the people who rely on Social Security and Medicare? And if you start means testing programs, how do you protect Social Security and Medicare universality?
Well, at least at this point, no one is talking about means testing Social Security and Medicare, at least not that I've seen. And so when the argument takes place about whether to limit a program to lower income individuals and families, right now, the only conversation along those lines is taking place about new programs, like the child tax credit, like low cost or no cost community college, like some healthcare expansions. But I think if either party did decide to only make Medicare or Social Security available to voters below a certain income level, I think they would face extraordinary voter wrath and even more extraordinary political repercussions. So I'd be very surprised to see that happening.
What's the historical track record for programs funded for a few years, hoping they will be extended?
There's really no reliable guide on this. Yeah, this is something that, as I mentioned earlier, Republicans have done on tax cuts. And when the Bush tax cuts were passed back in the early 2000s, they were done this way to fit under spending limits. And ultimately, the Democrats decided to repeal some of them. On spending programs, it's generally been harder to repeal them because the calculation is once voters become accustomed to receiving a particular service from a particular program, they're much less likely to give it up. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, is the perfect example of this. While it wasn't sunsetted, voters tended to be very strongly opposed to its passage. But once Obamacare had been the law of the land for a number of years, it's become much more popular because voters have become much more accustomed to having it and being able to rely on it. So for spending programs as opposed to taxes, it's more likely than not that a future Congress would extend them. But this now gets back to the question of mean testing. Because if you only make the program available to voters below a certain income level, the voters who never enjoyed the benefits of that program are going to be much less likely to support its extension. So decent prospects, but nothing's guaranteed. It is a gamble, no question.
This is probably a difficult number for you to just pull up, but how many school-age children lost a family member to COVID? What's the overlap with truancy?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. It's the type of research I haven't seen at that level of specificity and detail. And I don't know if the mental health and psychological issues that I mentioned earlier reflect, I would assume that they're much greater in families that suffered a loss or even suffered greatly from the virus, even if no one passed away from it. But I haven't seen the more specific breakdowns as it relates to truancy or other education-related matters. So I just don't know.
What about the world's billionaires stashing their wealth in offshore accounts? And I think this is referencing the Pandora Papers that just came out.
One of the most interesting things about the Pandora Papers report was, first, the relatively small number of wealthy Americans who were listed. The overwhelming majority of individuals who are part of that project, who are researchers as part of that project, end up being from other countries. And what I read in the second wave of coverage is that one of the main reasons for that is that the US tax code provides so many sanctuaries already for wealthy Americans to protect their money from higher taxes, that it's less necessary for an American of a certain wealth to engage with this kind of program as it is to a resident of other countries. My guess, and it is just a guess, is that this will provide additional fuel for a tax the rich movement, not just here in the US, but in other countries around the world. But of course, raising taxes on the rich, as Biden defines that, raising taxes of those who make over $400,000 a year, is already overwhelmingly popular. So while there will almost certainly be a very strenuous revisiting of some of the regulations in different countries around the world that allowed for these kind of protections, I don't see a tremendous political impact, at least not here in the United States, given where public opinion already is on the issue.
Is there any way to obligate information provided to be factual regarding news programs, and then the newscasters can go their different ways with their opinions? I recently heard a focus group that was full of misinformation.
Well, the question, as I understand it, is, are newscasts able to give their opinion and not just fact? And I think for anybody who watches cable news, you'll know that the answer to that is very decidedly yes. And there's a longer conversation than we've got time for over the next couple of minutes, and perhaps it's a topic, Jessica, that we can touch on in the future, about whether the primary obligation of news media is to provide as even-handed information as possible, or should it advocate in a particular direction for goals that would accomplish some type of social or community good? It's a fascinating conversation. And after many, many years of Americans believing by very, very large margins that the news media should provide that information in an even-handed and unbiased way, there's a growing number of people on both sides of the political aisle who believe that, in fact, the primary job of the news media is not just to present information dispassionately, but to advocate on behalf of certain causes and goals. Longer conversation for another day, and it's definitely one we should make one of our topics in the future.
Yeah, I saw a quote recently that said, journalism is the first draft of history. And so that kind of makes it an interesting prospect to figure out how those opinions get incorporated into the way that we can reference facts in our past. I thought that was an interesting quote.
George Orwell would have something to say about that, but that's a longer conversation for another day.
Awesome, thank you. One last question, if I can get it in, because it's an interesting one. What do you think of the $1 trillion platinum coin gambit being discussed as a way to get around the debt ceiling?
I'll note that even most of the supporters of inventing a $1 trillion coin to deal with the debt limit think it's a silly proposal. And I would have to agree with that.
Unless we find that coin, and then Dan will like that idea.
Well, I think that's right, but I would also argue that simply manufacturing more money, whether it's printing more bills or inventing a very large-scale coin, is not really solving the problem. It's pretending to. But since the debt limit is sort of a manufactured crisis in the country anyway, there's no need to have a debt limit. It could be raised just automatically instead of by congressional vote. I agree with the advocates for the coin who say that it might be a silly solution, but it's a silly solution to a necessary problem. I'm not sure it's a great idea, but I don't think it's a very likely outcome for the crisis.
Great. Well, to our audience, thank you so much for your questions. And Dan, thanks again. I know people have been really enjoying it when you narrow down to 2 topics just to go more in depth. So thanks again for a wonderful discussion, and I will turn it back over to you and Kim. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Jessica. Dan, that was so helpful navigating through these topics. And now I think we have at least 2 huge more topics for next Tuesday. So God bless the news. And God bless you for...
We're already set for next Tuesday as long as no more news happens, right, Kim?
You're right. Absolutely. Well, if you stick with me, I'm just going to go through quickly some of our upcoming programs for our viewers. On Thursday, a conversation with Edison International President and CEO, Pedro Pizarro. He will be speaking on California's pivotal climate change moment. Of course, next Tuesday, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus at 5 o'clock with Dan. On the 13th, Risk, a user's guide with General Stanley McChrystal. On the 15th, a conversation with Dr. Fiona Hill, moderated by Doyle McManus from the Los Angeles Times. And I guess we were pressing on this on October 21st, Social Media's Dark Side, a conversation with Roger McNamee. So please go to our website, register today, make a donation, become a member. We can't do this without you. Everybody, please stay safe and stay informed, and we hope to see you Thursday. And Dan, we can't wait till next Tuesday.
Thanks so much, Kim. Thanks, everybody.